This is the Common Health Podcast, a product of the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security. We engage with diverse leaders on the question of how best to navigate this period of exceptional turmoil, reform, and uncertainty in U.S. leadership. We are aided throughout by our able producer, Marla Hiller. I'm delighted today to be joined by a close friend, retired Major General Paul Friedrichs. Paul, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Steve.
Paul recently became a senior advisor to CSIS, to our program. We're very grateful for that. He's been very generous and very active while serving in government, and now out of government. He's also an adjunct professor of surgery at the Uniformed Services University for the Health Sciences in Bethesda. He served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and inaugural Director of the White House Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy, OPPR. Prior to that, served from 2019 to 2024 as the Joint Staff Surgeon at the Pentagon. Thank you so much, Paul. I wanted to use this conversation today to try to make sense of what's been happening here in the course of the Trump administration's first 10, 11 weeks in office now with respect to health security capabilities. And that includes the scientific enterprise of making sure that we're investing in sufficient R&D. It includes the active capabilities of detecting, preparing, and responding. This was really your orbit, and I'm trying to understand what has happened in this period in terms of preserving and sustaining and building upon those capabilities or eliminating or weakening them. We've been in the midst of a rapid-fire series of changes that have been enacted across a full spectrum of government agencies and programs that touch on global health, on health security, on humanitarian response, domestic and global. Let's just talk about the health security capabilities here domestically and international. And how do you take account? How do you take account in your own mind of what's happening?
Well, thank you. And first, I want to say thanks for being a part of the CSIS extended family, because this has been a remarkable opportunity following 39 years in government service. And I emphasize that point because in 39 years of serving the American people, I can't recall anything similar to this. And it is remarkable in many ways. The most remarkable part is actually not the specifics, because I think if I had the opportunity to go back and reread Project 2025 last week, and it is striking how much of what is happening today was laid out very clearly in there. And I don't think that these changes were completely unexpected, although there were statements made that they were not going to guide the administration's policies. If you go back and look at it, it's quite clear that a lot of the recommendations in that document are being implemented. I think that's important in this context because there are a number of recommendations in that document which have not yet been implemented. And so that would suggest that we have not reached the end of the envisioned changes and instead should anticipate additional changes going forward. With that in mind, and as I talk to colleagues around the government, I think it's almost fruitless at this point to try and chase individual actions and highlight those, and instead more valuable to begin crafting what does right look like and with whom do we have that discussion. I've had the great pleasure of talking to a number of our elected representatives on the Hill, and my perception from them is they're spending a lot of time responding to constituents who are concerned about individual actions, but they're also recognizing the impacts of what they're seeing unfolding, and they are eager to hear suggestions on what does right look like on the other side of this transformative moment.
So can we just pause for a moment? Give us your quick snapshot summary. What has changed so far and what may lie ahead? Before we talk about sort of trying to correct course and engage on the Hill and elsewhere with this is where we need to go in reconstituting capabilities in this new reality. But describe what has happened so far in your estimation.
So I think I'll start with the biodefense space because that's where I've spent the majority of the last 20 years working. And if you go back to 1996, every administration has published some sort of plan or executive order or strategy on biodefense and biosecurity or health security broadly. And in every one of those plans, and I have them all on a shelf in my office, they talk about core capabilities, the ability, for example, to perform biosurveillance, to monitor what's happening in the community, both domestically and globally. By shuttering most of the programs in USAID, we have lost access to data from those labs that we had been partnering with, and therefore are flying blind or have less visibility to what's happening in the biological space in other countries. Domestically, as we look at the changes that are happening in CDC, we've also significantly degraded our ability to monitor what's happening here at home, either with acute threats or with long-term chronic illnesses that merit additional interventions to try and mitigate them. Beyond biosurveillance, just seeing what's happening, then there's an important capability to protect the American public from illnesses, whether they're infectious or otherwise, and we also have degraded those capabilities. If you look at the portfolio of investments in research across the NIH, the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Department of Homeland Security, and the Veterans Administration, we were spending a large sum of money on investments in health and in life sciences. And it is true that those investments have not yielded as rapid an improvement in longevity and the length of life or the quality of life as we would have hoped. But stopping those investments or dramatically curtailing them seems unlikely to achieve those objectives either. And as we look at the combination of the normalization of the rates that NIH pays research universities, as well as the 60% planned cut in National Science Foundation funding for research, and the cuts in VA research, and the cuts in DoD research, and also the tenfold increase in taxes on endowments for universities, what we're seeing is this widespread assault on the research and development enterprise, which is going to force a substantial retrenchment in the sort of scientific work that we do in this country. And if that were done thoughtfully with a portfolio in mind that said we're rebalancing so that we can focus on these specific areas, that might be prudent. And clearly there's always opportunities to look for waste or to look for duplication. But instead, this seems to be largely focused at just stopping research in many of these core areas, not in a risk-informed way, but rather in an efficiency-driven way. And when we've done this in the past, it's never worked. Efficiency not informed by impacts or effectiveness usually winds up being inefficient, more expensive, because it has to be reversed at a greater cost when we discover the consequences of it. And our ability to maintain that research footprint is particularly concerning because when we look in the biosecurity space, we know that there are countries that are working on deliberate biological threats or bioweapons, and this country must be prepared to protect itself from those threats. We also know that accidental lab leaks or biological events are increasing in prevalence around the world, in part due to the large number of new labs being built that have relatively inexperienced staff and relatively immature oversight mechanisms. And we also know that naturally occurring biological threats are happening more frequently. There's no universe in which radically decreasing our ability to produce medical countermeasures will help mitigate the risks from deliberate, accidental, or naturally occurring threats at a time that all of those are increasing. And then we've got the challenge that we face from a resilience standpoint. So in the United States today, depending on the source, we face a shortage of between 20 to 30,000 physicians and around 300,000 nurses. The nursing shortage may improve over the next 10 years if some investments come to fruition. But on the physician side, the projections are that by 2035, we will face a shortage of 100,000 physicians. There's been nothing in the plans that have been laid out that address those workforce shortages. And those are the workers who will directly be caring for people with chronic diseases or people who are suffering from the consequences of a deliberate attack on this country. And as you put all of that together, it's as if someone took the playbooks that we've developed now in every administration going back 40 years and said, what can we do to make this country more vulnerable? What can we do to incentivize countries to double down on their investments in biological weapons because we are choosing not to protect ourselves the way we have in the past? And that's deeply concerning to me.
How are we going to, this is a scary argument that you're making, and the question is, how does this become manifest in a way that registers in the popular consciousness? What are the kind of incidents or developments are going to have that shock value? The changes you're describing are ones that are unfolding in the context of a wide-ranging series of cultural revolutionary changes that are happening across America, across the federal government, and permeating into, we've got universities in the barrel, we've got big law, we've got whole questions around the rule of law, the entitlement programs themselves, the large Medicaid, Medicare programs, Social Security, all these things are in question at a moment of great uncertainty, anxiety. And so when you single down and talk about the bioweapons, the accidental leaks, natural occurring, the sort of resilience in our health infrastructure, those don't automatically spring to mind when you're having a conversation with your relatives or friends about, well, how are you feeling about it? How are we doing? How is this first 100 days playing out? A lot of people are inclined to say, give it time. It's early days, supporters of the administration. I think that's a fair description of much of the discussion. The tariffs are forming another conversation around the stability of our economy. But on the specific things, the specific biodefense threats that you're talking about, give us your thoughts on how are we likely to be reminded of these vulnerabilities into the future? What form is that going to take?
Yeah, I think those are great points that you make, Steve. And the challenge with so many of the changes that have been implemented so far is that they are not directly impacting the average American at the kitchen table at this moment in time. There are a couple that I would highlight. And, one of the things that we worked on over the last 2 years were medical shortages, and in particular pharmaceutical shortages. The United States has historically been the world leader in artificial intelligence, the world leader in biotechnology, and the world leader in computational ability and compute. And that confluence of those three portfolios, if you will, has allowed us to do some absolutely extraordinary things. As we take down investments in biotechnology and research in that area, it's difficult to envision how you can remain a world leader if you're no longer investing in those sorts of capabilities. And so one of the near-term consequences is that we will likely see more shortages of pharmaceuticals and higher prices, and we will become more dependent on other countries which are continuing to invest in these areas. I think it's to the great credit of the Chinese that the People's Republic of China recognized years ago that there was tremendous potential in this space, and they have been very actively investing in dual-use technologies and have made real progress. And now some of the cutting-edge drugs are being developed in China. We need to recognize that we will be purchasing more of our drugs from China. And if they choose not to sell them to us, we will not have access to those drugs. But even in the more basic space, the Chinese very thoughtfully have looked at supply chains and have been purchasing driving out of business those companies that were contributors to the supply chains for a variety of pharmaceuticals. Penicillin is a great example. The first antibiotic, or one of the first antibiotics. It's been a lifesaver that we've used for centuries now. The ingredients for that are all produced in China. There's no one in the United States that produces those raw materials anymore. And should they choose not to sell those to us, that will have a direct and immediate impact. And so as we go forward and we think about a confrontational approach, we need to recognize that in those areas in which we are now dependent on China, we will face potentially some really significant consequences. And the way to mitigate that is actually to build up and strengthen our alliances. And I use penicillin as an example because Japan, historically, for the last 80 years, one of our closest allies, unlike the United States, recognized this dependency on China and has begun producing these key ingredients within Japan. There's a real opportunity, rather than putting tariffs on pharmaceuticals from Japan, to instead incentivize purchasing penicillin ingredients from Japan and then producing them in this country so that they are incented to expand their capacity, we reduce our vulnerability to China, and we strengthen our partnership with a country that has been one of our closest allies. So I think, this space to watch that's going to most immediately impact Americans is going to be in this supply chain space.
Where we're going to have drug interruptions, where we're going to have, if we have a prolonged confrontation with China escalating around tariffs that includes pharmaceuticals, active ingredients in the production, but also vaccines, biologics, sterile injectables, we're going to see those we're critically dependent upon China for those, and India.
That's exactly right. And we saw them leverage that dependency during the COVID pandemic, and we've seen it with rare earth minerals and other things in which they control the supply chain. So I applaud this administration for recognizing that we should be increasing our resilience. I don't understand how the current actions are going to accomplish that. Where we have the real opportunity is to partner with other countries around the world to build more resilient supply chains, to expand research and development. I agree that we should look at our research and development portfolio and rationalize it, and we should do that in partnership with our closest allies. But those allies are doing exactly the same work that we are doing in trying to reduce their vulnerabilities and improve their resilience. We should be seeking to do that with them rather than throwing tariffs or other actions that cause them to question whether they should partner with us or not. And I think as we go forward in this, we're going to see real opportunities to make America not only healthier because we're bringing better pharmaceuticals to the market and we're addressing shortages, but also to make America the trusted partner around the world that it historically has been.
Now, you've been involved in your prior work at the White House, at the OPPR, at the Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response Policy. You were engaged with the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, which addressed this issue. And they've just come out with their final report and conclusions. They rolled this out last week. They're coming here this week to do briefings. We're going to engage with them a little later on the China Working Group. They have strong bipartisan support in Congress. They have a concrete proposal, $15 billion. What do you make of this? I know you've been involved in counseling them and responding to different iterations of their work.
I think that their report is excellent, and I encourage anyone who's interested in this broad area to read the report and to look at the recommendations. I particularly hope that our congressional elected leaders will look at their recommendations, because I think that they lay out a very broad and deep approach to mitigating risk that, again, highlights the importance of working with partners, because there's not enough money in the world to do everything just here in the United States, and also building those relationships, those networks that allow us to dissuade countries from trying to leverage a particular chokehold on a supply chain to their benefit and to our detriment. All of this is about balancing risk and opportunity, and ultimately, our greatest deterrent strength has been the assurance that our system economically, our health system, and our security system was sufficiently resilient that no matter what other countries did, we would detect it, we would be able to protect the American people from it, and we would be able to respond and hold people accountable. I think that the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology adds significantly to that narrative by highlighting the investments that we must make. Ultimately, it boils down to, as the president has said, and as previous presidents have said, the United States, as the world leader in AI, as the world leader in biotechnology, and as the world leader in compute, will be safer it will be more prosperous and it will be healthier. But the way to achieve those three goals of safety, economic prosperity, and a healthier population is by remaining the world leader in those three domains. And the way to do that is not by taking a sledgehammer or a chainsaw to those capabilities, but with a really thoughtful strategy of how to remain the world leader.
A couple of questions. One, some people who are close observers of what's happening are arguing that as our investments in resilience lag, as we are doing less in terms of tracking and responding and anticipating naturally occurring biothreats, accidental leaks, pernicious bioengineering of weapons, biological weapons, that inexorably there's going to be a turn towards dependence on DoD as our civilian capabilities are weakened. Say a bit about that.
So, again, I've had the great privilege of serving in uniform for 37 years, and in various roles have responded to natural disasters in support of civilian leaders. I've responded to man-made disasters and wars in support of our civilian leadership. My colleagues in uniform continue to do all of those things. But the civilian capabilities that we had supported in the past, in some cases, no longer exist. And that means when the next event occurs, and that capability within FEMA or within HHS or within USAID is gone, the only thing left in the toolkit is going to be the Department of Defense. I'm very concerned that if the thought from a risk mitigation standpoint is, well, that doesn't happen that often, and when we need it, we'll just have DoD do it. What we will discover is DoD can do many miraculous things, but DoD is often more expensive, and it comes at a cost, because that means that those assets being used for that typically non-DoD function are not doing whatever it is that they were supposed to be doing as part of the Department of Defense. That's a short-term approach, which we have occasionally leveraged. It is not a long-term strategy for success. Yet a great example is disaster response around the world. USAID had incredible capabilities that were purpose-built, world-renowned for being the best in the world for responding to disasters and then partnering with other countries to help coordinate that disaster response and ensure that we didn't duplicate effort and that people were working well together. That capability is gone. And I suspect what we will discover, back to your earlier question of how will Americans notice this, when there's a natural disaster that involves American citizens and they look for where's the American response, there will either be very little response or it will be a military response, which is not how we've typically supported our citizens overseas.
Now, we've got some active challenges in our country today. We have a measles outbreak centered in western part of Texas and across the border in New Mexico, now Kansas, Oklahoma. The data released on Friday shows it's continuing to scale up, over 750 confirmed cases. I wanted to ask you to comment on how is that, in your estimation, how is that being managed and unfolding? Where is that likely to lead us? Then another issue that you've been deeply involved in, where I'd like to, after we've talked about measles, let's talk about H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza. So let's start with measles.
Yeah, so I'm stunned to see this measles outbreak unfolding the way that it is. You know, we had an outbreak in Chicago and an outbreak in New York over the last 4 years, quickly contained them, even though they began in populations that had low immunization rates. We were able to swarm in resources and were able to quickly take actions, offer support to families and to the local healthcare system that allowed both of those communities to successfully contain the outbreaks at much lower numbers. I was listening to something this morning. I believe this is the largest outbreak in at least 25 years now, and if not longer. This is deeply disturbing because we are now muddying the waters with those we are supposed to be supporting and informing by offering competing narratives about how best to protect themselves and their children. This is new. You know, the concept of vaccination and the benefits of vaccination have been accepted and widely shared for decades because they are so strikingly positive in offering tremendous benefit to the average American and to their children. I mean, the last time we saw measles outbreaks with large numbers of children in the pre-vaccination era, we were seeing tens of thousands of children getting sick. We were seeing hundreds a year dying. It would be tragic to go back to that because people are mistakenly led to believe that vitamin A, for example, is protective. It is absolutely not. And yet it's being held up as if somehow that is comparable to a vaccine. That's untrue. There is no science to support that. We're revisiting topics which we have studied extensively, not only here in the United States, but around the world. This question of the vaccines causing autism has been extensively studied, and the papers which originally purported to show that have been withdrawn because they were found to be poorly done and not credible.
This is the Wakefield 1998 Lancet piece.
That's correct. And, I think that if the plan is to address the concerns that have been raised by collecting additional data and doing that in a transparent, objective fashion that can allay concerns, that will be valuable, since so many have tried to make this an issue, I think, in a very unhelpful and inaccurate way. But I am concerned now as I hear the discussion about how some of these efforts are going to be undertaken, whether they will indeed be transparent and objective. We have an enormous amount of data that we've collected for decades that have shown that children who are vaccinated are much less likely to develop measles, in fact, almost never develop measles, and never die, or almost never die unless they're immunocompromised, and that these vaccines are very safe. To suggest to parents that overwhelming volume of data is inaccurate, I think does a tremendous disservice to those parents who are trying to make a decision about what's best for the children. But it also does a tremendous disservice to the legions of healthcare providers and researchers and others who have done this work for decades trying to protect America's children. I think we need to step back for a second and acknowledge how compelling the data is showing the safety and efficacy of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine and multiple other vaccines that we offer to children, and use that as a starting point for discussions. On the H5N1 front, this is a perplexing challenge, and this goes back to at what point will this impact the average American? Certainly, egg prices are impacting the average American, and we had heard some assertions that those would be rapidly declining. Haven't seen, that very large drop back down to the levels that we had seen before. And I do applaud the administration. I think we should ask the question why an 8% drop in layers led to a 100% increase in cost. Mathematically, I'm from South Louisiana. I just don't get it. If you lose 100% of the chicken, you don't have any eggs. If you lose 50% of the chicken, maybe prices go up 100%. But if you lose less than 10%, how does that cause prices to go up 100%? That's a really great question, which I'm hoping will be part of the work that this administration does going forward.
What more needs to happen now in terms of addressing this reality that we have a proliferating new variants of this virus affecting both dairy populations and poultry and workers, threatening workers, and a continued fluidity and unpredictability around what happens genomically in this virus?
Yeah, I think this goes back to some of what we were talking about at the beginning of this session. Biosurveillance is incredibly important, and it took a long time to get all of the tools in place that we had at the end of December of last year. But at that point, we had a very robust wastewater surveillance program, which in a number of cases helped us identify new outbreaks of H5N1 in cattle or in poultry or in humans before we saw it with people coming into the healthcare system seeking care. I hope that the administration will preserve and actually expand that, and the technologies that they've said they want to invest in would allow us to make that an even better addition to the traditional biosurveillance tools that we have. I think that the administration has the opportunity not to cut the CDC surveillance capabilities, but to continue the remarkable work that was being done following the COVID pandemic in improving the automation of data sharing in this space. So during the pandemic, we had a number of jurisdictions that still were using fax machines to send data to the CDC or to other federal agencies. There's been a significant investment made in 2023 and in 2024 in automating a lot of those functions and in helping states replace antiquated systems with more modern systems. In addition to that, there had been a tremendous partnership with the vendors of electronic health records to share data automatically and electronically so that it didn't have to be a manual process where data went from a hospital to an office, then an office had to share it with another office who had to clear it to share it with another office. That's really work that needs to be done that could revolutionize our ability to see what's happening around the country in near real time. That technology all exists. It appears that some of the funding for that may not continue in the president's budget, and I hope that that is not the case. I hope that both the president and Congress will remain committed to the health of the American public and ensuring that we have the ability across the country to see when there are spikes in illness around the country, not just with H5N1, but with other diseases. Beyond biosurveillance in humans, we were very excited to finally be able to roll out the National Milk Testing Strategy, which was an effort to test milk before it was pasteurized to identify which herds had H5N1. I was very disappointed that some of the states chose not to participate in that. It was a voluntary program. And I think that that's incredibly unwise that they would choose not to participate in how we mitigate the risk of national programs, especially because some of those states that chose not to participate were states that were at the beginning of this outbreak and, could have helped us potentially contain it if we had had greater collaboration.
One of those is Wisconsin.
Well, Wisconsin's the largest dairy producing state, and Wisconsin has chosen not to participate in the surveillance program, which is very unfortunate. But Texas is another state that has not been participating, and that's where this was first detected. What we saw from March 24th, when I first learned of the outbreak, through months afterwards, was it was very difficult to understand the breadth of the outbreak. And because many of our agricultural and livestock industries move animals around, it was difficult to contain the outbreak without good surveillance data. And so I continue to advocate strongly that Congress and the President ensure that we have funding for the national milk testing system and for the human surveillance systems, and also for the wildlife surveillance systems. This is an ugly part of this outbreak, which really, unfortunately, dates back now decades because this started in 1996. But it's the migratory birds which have carried this virus in and out of our country. And our USDA colleagues, Department of Agriculture colleagues, have had a very good surveillance program, not only for migratory birds, but for multiple other species. As this virus continues to mutate and now spread into more than 30 mammalian species, into pigs and cats and others beyond just humans. And
lots of aquatic species.
Right, lots of aquatic species. We should be investing in improving our surveillance, detecting when there's an outbreak in a new species, and also investing in our ability to do the genomic sequencing to identify if there are changes in the virus that pose greater risk to humans. Because we are taking down our research into medical countermeasures, we are, through the cuts in our research programs, it will take us longer, in all likelihood, to build the medical countermeasures that we will need in the future if these cuts continue. So we need to identify as quickly as possible when there's a change that would warrant changing or producing new medical countermeasures, and we need to ensure that we have those capabilities in place.
One of the last actions that you took in the White House just prior to President Trump's inauguration was the award to Moderna from BARDA, a major award for mRNA vaccines for, I think, 4 variants of flu vaccine. This is the kind of forward-looking scientific innovation that is meant to build our protections. This has now been paused for review, as I understand it. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so a little bit of background on vaccines in general. So there's primarily 3 ways they can be produced: through an egg-based production process, a cell-based production process, or with the mRNA platform. The first 2 have been used for years, and we have lots of experience with those, and we have capacity in the United States to do that. But unfortunately, they take months to produce enough. The estimate was to produce enough to protect enough vaccine to produce the American public. If we stopped producing other vaccines, could take up to 18 months with those two technologies. That's not that the technologies are bad. They're very good. But if we had another mutation that caused this virus or any other pathogen to result in greater human illness or death, 18 months is a long time to tell families to wait to protect their loved ones. 18 months is a long time to tell businesses to wait, not knowing what their workforce will be. 18 months is a long time to tell allies and partners to close their borders because we're unable to protect our population. The remarkable attribute, one of the remarkable attributes of the mRNA vaccine platform is that if a safe and effective vaccine is approved by the FDA, the recipe, if you will, for that particular vaccine and the production can occur much more quickly without sacrificing safety or efficacy. It has the same oversight as with the other two types of vaccine production, but it is scalable, or you can expand the quantity being produced, and you can adjust the recipe much more rapidly than with the other two types of vaccines. Ultimately, we want to have all three, because we don't want to be in a place where we, for example, stop doing mRNA production in this country and are dependent on other countries for that. That would mean during that 18-month window that I mentioned, we would be turning to China or we would be turning to Europe and asking if they would sell us vaccines that were developed using the technology that, frankly, we created here in the United States. So there's a very real risk that if we don't continue to invest in these platforms, we will be left behind because others recognize the value of them. I was not personally involved in the investment in Moderna. There was a broad effort to continue the old approach of taking multiple shots on goal, recognizing that vaccine production and research remains a very complex craft. We're very fortunate that we've got great industry partners that have continued to invest in this area, but they've highlighted that it is a low-margin area, and they've also highlighted that there's no certainty that investing on a particular early-stage research effort will result in a vaccine. During Operation Warp Speed, which is regularly held up as the benchmark of success in vaccine production, we actually invested in 6 vaccines up front, and only 2 of those ultimately proved to be scalable and were able to come to market in large enough quantities. Both of those, interestingly, were mRNA vaccines. So what we had tried to do was to broaden the portfolio of investments, looking at how do we have as many shots on goal as possible to ensure that we are ready for whatever the next pathogen is that comes forward. And we have the infrastructure in this country so that we're not dependent on China or Europe or someone else in exigent circumstances for producing rapidly a safe and effective vaccine.
Some of what we seem to be observing now and experiencing, things like the decision to pull and review this award to Moderna, there are other examples here, particularly around vaccines, the postponement or cancellation of key committee meetings in ACIP and CDC, the counterpart of the FDA, VRBAC committee, and other things suggest that there's really a strong hangover effect from COVID in terms of an antagonism against mRNA and against vaccines writ large. And that's part of what we're seeing here as a kind of retribution, a sort of lasting after effect of the frustration and anger that people experienced during COVID that's now with us and complicating our ability to think very clearly about moving to this next phase. Say a bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, so for any of the listeners who really want to better understand this, I encourage them to read John Barry's book, The Great Influenza. He writes about the 1918 to 1920 influenza pandemic that was even more lethal than the COVID pandemic. And it's a wonderful historical book in that regard. But I think the greatest value of that book are the last 2 chapters that talk about what happened after the pandemic. And it's very similar to what we're seeing today.
Amnesia.
People were rightfully angry, frustrated, and scared. They felt that they had been let down by those that they trusted. They lost loved ones. They lost businesses. In some cases, they lost homes, livelihood, and they wanted someone to blame. And it took years to work through that emotional cost of that pandemic. And the author does a great job of laying out how complex that public dynamic was and how fraught the discussions were, and how politicians chose to leverage those as strongly held emotions for political benefit at the cost of public health. Unfortunately, I think that's what we're seeing today, that people are leveraging these very understandable emotions that have come as a result of the trauma that we collectively experience not only here in the United States but around the world. And people are trying to leverage those emotions in a way that then yields political benefit. I think there's great value in looking at our research and development portfolios. And in fact, our office started to do that. We spend tens of billions of dollars on that. And we should be accountable to the American public for where every one of those dollars go. We found that it was very difficult to get departments and agencies to fully expose their portfolio. That should change, and I applaud the administration for trying to drive that discussion forward. We should look for where there's duplication or in some cases redundancy, and we should repurpose that money. But we should not vilify the people who are doing the research, because these are people who are trying to help somebody's mother or their grandmother. We should not vilify the technology that saves so many lives, because in reality, that's exactly what happened. These technologies that people are attacking now were responsible for saving millions of lives because we were able to get vaccines and monoclonal antibodies and other medical countermeasures out much more rapidly than we would have done otherwise. The successes that we saw, and there were, some real successes, came as a result of our nation's lifelong, many-decade investment in a robust research and development enterprise across the country. Came from partnerships with industry and with academia. But most importantly, it came from a sense of trust. When we went through the pandemic, there was a moment in time that we trusted that we were working together. And I think it goes back to what this country has had on its currency almost since its inception, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. The greatest strength of this country has been when we choose to focus as a nation on our collective benefit, not when we choose to focus on why we dislike someone or why we attack someone or why we vilify someone. The greatest risk that I see in all of these discussions is that we are playing to our worst angels instead of playing to the real strength of this country, which is our commitment to an ideal of freedom, of democracy, and the reality that our children will have a better life than we did. That's what's at risk.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's close, as we ask all of our guests, let's close with some thoughts about the future and where to find optimism and hope in this very difficult moment that we're in right now. Tell us where we should be looking forward positively in this period. Where do you find the greatest hope?
Two answers. The first one is we are at an inflection point. If we don't tear apart our research and development and industrial capacity in this area, we really are at an inflection point, not just in healthcare, but in biotechnology. The National Security Commission that you mentioned does a nice job of highlighting this. But things that we thought 10 years ago would be in the realm of science fiction are now becoming a reality. We're seeing precise drugs being developed using technologies that most of us didn't even know existed 5 years ago. We're seeing the pace of change happening so rapidly that it's almost impossible to keep up with the developments and the discoveries that are happening in labs all over this country or were happening prior to some of the cuts being implemented. I am optimistic if we can step back, take a deep breath, do the appropriate reviews for duplicative or unnecessary investments, and continue to invest in those portfolios that ensure the United States is the world leader in AI, biotech, and compute, that we will see a healthier America. We will see a more economically secure America, and we will see an America that is able to deter anyone who chooses to threaten us because we have the best in the world in those areas. The second reason for optimism is this country for 248, nearly 249 years, has struggled to create a more perfect union. We have recognized what we have is never good enough for everyone, and we've aspired to be better. We can't turn our back on that aspiration to make life better for everyone. This cannot become a discussion, nor have we let it as a nation become how some of us can benefit while others suffer. My optimism comes from the fact that for nearly 250 years, we have actually focused on our nation becoming more perfect, a point we certainly haven't reached yet. But we've managed to do that successfully for nearly 250 years, and I have confidence we will again.
Thank you so much, Paul, for being with us today. Thank you for your 4 decades of service to our country. Thank you for being part of CSIS. We're just so grateful to have you with us, and this has been a great conversation.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Common Health. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a follow and leave a review. To learn more about the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security or listen to other CSIS podcasts, please visit csis.org.